What did I tell you? Now, I'm so pleased to introduce our guest speakers tonight. Our moderator is Liz Goldwyn. Liz is an author, filmmaker, and the founder of The Sex Ed. Beginning with her first job as an intern for Planned Parenthood in Los Angeles when she was 13 years old, Goldwyn has dedicated much of her life to exploring the depths of human sexuality through her books and films based on original historic research. These works include her documentary Pretty Things and her nonfiction book Pretty Things, The Last Generation of American Burlesque Queens, about American burlesque and the advent of striptease from 1840 to 1960. Goldwyn is also the author of the novel Sporting Guide, set in a world of vice and prostitution in Los Angeles in the 1890s. She's a passionate advocate of sex education and providing resources for others to explore sexual wellness and consciousness. Ryan White is the brilliant director of Ask Dr Ruth. Most recently, he directed The Keepers, a 7-part Emmy-nominated documentary series for Netflix, and HBO's The Case Against 8, which won the Directing Award at Sundance and was shortlisted for the Academy Award. White's additional films include Serena, Good Old Frida, and Pelada. So now please join me in welcoming Liz Goldwyn and Ryan White.
Wow, thank you all for being here. Did you like the movie? She's a real spitfire, Dr. Ruth.
She is.
What was it like being pursued by, I guess she was like 88 at the time? Like an 88-year-old who wanted you to make her movie?
Yeah, but she didn't pursue me as much as, like, Dr. Ruth doesn't pursue anyone. I think Rafi Marmor, our producer down there, actually called me 2 years ago and was running a couple ideas by me for documentary films, and the first one that he ran by me was about Dr. Ruth, and I can't even remember what the other ideas were now. You might, but I, of course, grew up in the 80s and 90s, and so knew who she was because she was all over the airwaves when I was a child and then an adolescent.
Did you watch her show or listen to her
Yeah, I mean,
radio
I
show?
think I knew more Dr. Ruth, the caricature than the real person. Like, I remember the woman that played her on Saturday Night Live, or I remembered impressions of her, and I knew she, or at least as a child, to me, she was, you know, the older woman on television saying things that I shouldn't listen to. So I had definitely no grasp of the true impact of Dr. Ruth on people, especially older than myself, and the impact that she had on so many parts of the sexual revolution that I've been able to enjoy in my life. I'm gay, so, you know, it was actually after our first dinner with her in New York, where we went outside, and she was waiting on her car, which every driver she calls Mr. Uber, whether it's a Lyft or a black car. And, like, right as Mr. Uber showed up and she was getting in the car, that a gay gentleman walked up and just said something, just like Jonathan Capehart in the film, just said something very simple, recognized her on the street and said, "I want to thank you. I used to listen to you secretly in my bedroom." So I had no real grasp of that until the documentary was presented to me as an idea. And then, of course, once I met her, I totally fell in love with her at that first dinner. And then, of course, I also wasn't aware of her backstory. I mean, Rafi had told me in the initial phone call that she was a survivor of the Holocaust, but at that dinner, she started telling us all of the stories of her past, and then I was totally sold on doing it with her.
I was surprised, actually, in the movie that her children were not very familiar with her stories about her mother and her father. She wasn't seem like she'd previously opened up that much to them about it, but you got her to open up in the movie.
Yeah, I mean, I think that was one of the biggest challenges in the film, was to, you know, Dr. Ruth is probably the most famous relationship therapist, and so very ironically, you would think a therapist and a psychologist is very in tune with their emotions, but she doesn't like touching that painful past, and I think that's totally understandable. And so I think it was one of the biggest challenges in the film, was to not feel like I was pushing her too much. A great example is that scene at Yad Vashem, the Holocaust Remembrance Center, where we would have never asked Dr. Ruth to do something so painful as to look up her family's death records for the first time. That was something she came to us with the idea. So Rafi was very good at persuading. Like Dr. Ruth had said no to documentaries for many decades, and so once he persuaded her to participate, I think she was very deliberate in how she was going to do certain things in this documentary that she knew would last forever. And I think one of them was looking up those records, which was very painful for her. And to your question about the family, one of her first rules to us, actually, at that dinner, she said, "You won't talk to my family." I'm the woman who talks about erections and orgasms, and I've never wanted my children, and especially my grandchildren, to be tied to that reputation if they don't want to be. And so that began like a give and take of me trying to convince her that her children and grandchildren participating would make it a more dimensional film, and thankfully she eventually got on board for that.
I mean, it's really interesting, this idea. First of all, it's much easier to give advice than take your own, right? So we can't expect even relationship and sex therapists to have it all figured out. But it's interesting because, it was sort of okay for Dr. Ruth to say things like vagina and penis and erection on radio and television because she was an older woman and she wasn't considered like in her sexual prime. I think that was, when you say she didn't want her children to be associated with sex, it's almost like, even though Dr. Ruth was talking about sex, you didn't see Dr. Ruth and think she was like illicit, right? She was sort of PG.
Yeah, I mean, and I think that's part of what, like I love one of the opening scene when she reveals she's lived in that same apartment for 50-something years. The fact that Dr. Ruth became famous in her mid-50s, I think, is why she is so grounded. So the film is a totally accurate portrayal of Dr. Ruth in the sense that, like, she has no diva bone in her entire body. There's no part of her where she acts like a celebrity or she's entitled to things. But I think that's definitely a byproduct of having lived 55 years before you became famous and having raised a family for 55 years before you were famous. And therefore, she protects her kids in a way like, that she had already raised them. They were in their 20s, and I think Miriam was almost 30 when she became famous. And so she never wanted that late life celebrity to be, too intrusive in their lives.
Yeah, she has a lot of diplomacy as well, which I guess maybe comes with age. Diplomacy, and she's disarming. Like when the guy calls in and says, during the height of the AIDS crisis, and he's talking about how he's worried that his girlfriend is going to catch AIDS because she hangs out with all these gay men and she's sharing drinks. And the way that she deals with him is it's diplomatic. She doesn't come out and point out his biases right off the bat, to sort of, which might make him go on the defensive. I thought that was interesting. What was that like when you were going through like some of the archives from Sexually Speaking?
Well, I think, I was born in 1981, which is the year that Dr. Ruth started Sexually Speaking. So I was a teenager in the mid-90s when Dr. Ruth was going off of television. And so I think that's why when Rafi said, "Would you like to meet Dr. Ruth?" I didn't know where Dr. Ruth was. I hadn't followed her life after she was on television. And one thing that we don't include in the film, but I love for people to understand, is that Dr. Ruth voluntarily gave up that television career in the mid-90s when talk shows started steering the direction of being more sensational and exploiting guests, and she was getting pushed in that direction. Because as you see in the archival in the film, by today's standards, it's very tame. It's very educational, and nothing is sensational. And one other really interesting factor that, I've been traveling the country with Dr. Ruth over the past couple months and doing a lot of press with her, and she always likes to point out, there's one woman in the film who she's counseling who had an abortion. And she always likes to point out that woman was an actress. And so what Dr. Ruth did on her television shows is none of the people who showed their face were real people. They had learned a real story And then they went on the show, and Dr. Ruth didn't know what they were going to talk about, and she she says you can never do therapy on the air, so she would do advice with them. And so everybody on the radio, of course, was real because they could use fake names and their faces weren't on there. But when the Jerry Springers and Maury Poviches started taking over, and that's what television execs want, Dr. Ruth bowed out because of that, and she said I was fine returning to academia and returning to writing books. So that really was the end of her television career.
Wow, that's interesting. I didn't know that. She was like the first single name only celebrity TV doctor. I mean, she spawned a whole cottage industry. So she's written 40, almost over 40. She's gonna have a new book come out later this year. She written over 40 books on sex and sexuality. She's married 3 times. Her third marriage to Fred Westheimer lasted 36 years. So I want to know what relationship advice she gave you, because I'm sure there must have been some.
One of the things that really endeared me to Dr. Ruth from the moment I met her was when we had dinner with her, she pulled up her chair next to mine. And you see this kind of in the film. She touches everyone's hands when she talks to them, like Walter, her first boyfriend. We have that shot of their hands on each other at the end of that scene. And she was very concerned with why I was single and wanted to know what my mom thought about that. And
did she have any setups?
No. And as the film went along, I think the most surprising thing about Dr. Ruth is that she never talks about sex. I've never heard her talk about sex outside of a professional setting. If I ever tried to talk to her about sex, which I didn't, she would have kicked me out of the room. It's not something that she does in her day-to-day life. But I think she's known as the famous sex therapist. I think people forget that she was also a relationship therapist and a family therapist. And that stuff, as you see in the film through Planned Parenthood, is how she ended up in the industry of sex therapy. And so that's the stuff that I think she is truly passionate about. And that stuff you see her ask all day long, whether it's Mr. Uber by the end of the drive. She knows every relationship that he or she has been in, or whether that's me. And so I will say she was thrilled by the end of filming because I not only had a boyfriend, but he was Jewish and short. And Miriam, her daughter, always says, I'm not sure if my mom's happier with the film or the fact that you have a short Jewish boyfriend.
What does she think of dating apps?
She's all for them. I've heard her say a million times, she's all for dating apps as long as you are doing it safely. She's concerned about people, meeting in places that are secluded or meeting up with someone that they don't have enough information on. But she also always says, just like she's all for pornography, but she always says, be realistic. No one's dating app profile is completely true, and no sex and porn is completely true.
Yeah, it's a movie. They're actors, just like, I guess, on her show. So you were telling me that your last film, which is on Netflix, The Keepers, which is set in, sadly, world of sexual abuse in the Roman Catholic Church and the criminal justice system's treatment of it was really dark. And this was sort of your way back into the light side of sexuality?
Yeah, I think in many ways taking on this project was kind of a selfish move because we had been making The Keepers for many years, which if you haven't seen it is about the darkest sides of human sexuality. It's about child sex abuse and really pervasive child sex abuse. And making that, I think, took not just me, but my whole team, and my whole team ended up working on Ask Dr. Ruth too, my editors, my producers, took us to a very dark place. And so as The Keepers was coming out, I think we were all a little bit disoriented with how we come out of that experience. And it was that same month that The Keepers came out that I met Dr. Ruth. And I knew the moment I met her, and not just sexually speaking, the idea that this beacon of light could be in our lives in a way that The Keepers was the opposite. There's many people in The Keepers that are dear to me, but the basis of The Keepers is so dark. The idea that we could get to work with someone and work on the story of someone and collaborate with someone who, despite having gone through, you know, I would argue for a living public figure, probably the most harrowing survival story, to be such an optimistic force in the world, and to be, the energy that you just saw is the real Dr. Ruth. I mean, every interaction with someone, she's that excited to meet them. Every meal is the best meal she's ever had.
And she walks really fast. She's like a speed walker, huh?
Yeah, I don't know. She doesn't like you lagging behind, so you have to keep up with her. So it really was like the perfect counterbalance to kind of coming out of the darkness of making The Keepers.
So, I mean, this film, which is going to be in theaters next week, and then it's going to be on Hulu, and The Keeper, which is on Netflix. So we're in this culture now, right, of streaming and chill, which actually supposedly leads to less sex, right? Because you're tuned into there's just an article that came out today that says our streaming culture is leading to less sex, but also kids are having less sex now because it's almost like we're so inundated. So what do you think Dr. Ruth would say about that? Would she say to put down our devices and connect?
You nailed it. I just heard her say it 2 days ago. Yeah, I think her biggest concerns, because I hear her get asked a lot, what has changed over the last 30 years since you were on the radio and television. And she says that we're much more sexually literate today. So she does not hear the same questions about females having difficulty reaching orgasm or premature ejaculation or erectile dysfunction. She says she doesn't hear as many questions about that because of sexual literacy, which she was a part of. But what she says she hears a lot of questions about now, which she thinks is linked to your question, is loneliness, which is her major concern. So the book you mentioned is Sex for Dummies, which she wrote in the 80s or maybe the early 90s. And then she has a new version coming out geared towards millennials. And it's going to have extra chapters about loneliness, and that's sort of linked in a lot of ways. Not to our devices, I would say, but what she calls the loss of the art of conversation. So Dr. Ruth, I mean, she has a cell phone, but she doesn't use it besides to use the phone. So when you're with her, she is fully engaged, and she expects you to be fully engaged. And I think she doesn't just talk about this in a sexual or even romantic way. She talks about it with families as well. When she's at a restaurant and sees everybody in the family on their phone, she gets really concerned that the art of conversation is being lost, and therefore is leading to more loneliness, and therefore leading to less sex amongst younger people.
But also, like you said, she has a background of relationship and family therapy, and she's talking a lot about intimacy. So sex is not something she's approaching as just sort of a way to escape, right? Like streaming and tuning out. It's a way to connect.
Yeah, and I mean, I think you hear her say it a couple times in the film, but she always says, which I think is the funniest sentence because no one thinks of her this way, she always says, I'm old-fashioned and I'm a square. And nobody thinks of Dr. Ruth that way because she was so cutting edge when she was on radio and television. But if you read Dr. Ruth's advice as of late, and even going back 30 years, she's always for intimacy and sex within relationships. She doesn't, I've heard her say.
No polyamory.
Yeah, it's more, she was America's sex therapist during the AIDS crisis. So sexually transmitted diseases, it drives her crazy when people don't use protection and are having indiscriminate sex without knowing where their partner has been. And so all of her advice, even now, which is I think somewhat old-fashioned to young people, is she's not for hookup culture. She's not for indiscriminate sex. She's always thinks the best sex comes out of a relationship, and that takes some sort of intimacy before you've gotten into bed.
Well, because there's more trust. So when there's more trust, there's more freedom to let loose and experiment, right? I get it though. Being I'm old-fashioned too, and I'm in the sex education field, but I'm maybe not as old-fashioned as she is. But I can understand that, sort of having like family values. What are some of the things that she said that really shocked you? Because I love this one quote where she's talking about, not in the film, but I've read her. She said, "Oh, well, this woman said that she liked to toss fried onion rings on her boyfriend's erect penis, and that allowed me to say in a very wonderful way that I think anything two consenting adults do is in the privacy of their home is fine."
That moment almost made it into the film.
Why did you cut it?
Do
you think do you think that really happened? Like, it kind of made me want to try.
I do think it really happened, knowing Dr. Ruth. I mean, no anecdote comes out of thin air. No, I mean, like I said, there was very little sex talk in the making of the film, and I think. I made a film about Serena Williams, and people would always ask me afterwards, because I was a tennis player, like, "Oh, did you ever get to hit with her?" And I would say, like, the last thing Serena Williams would ever want to do. I would have been fired on the spot if the filmmaker had said, like, "Can I hit the tennis ball with you?" That is her job. So there were never situations. I mean, there's the archival, of course, where I got to delve deeply, and mostly my team.
But what was like the most shocking thing you found from the archival? Like, what was a question that really blew you away? Or was it really mundane back then because we didn't have the internet to go to, so people were asking over and over again about how do I orgasm, what's up with premature ejaculation?
I wouldn't call it mundane, but there weren't those types of any question, because things got vetted before they got to Dr. Ruth, and they knew how serious Dr. Ruth took this. Any question that seemed like Susan Brown, who's the woman who she's in the film. She was like a very young woman, like teenager when she was taking the calls. So they would get a lot of calls of like ridiculous sexual questions. And then you would start hearing teenagers laughing in the background, and those calls got filtered out right away. And so there was very little that I think made it to Dr. Ruth because she took it so seriously. That was that ridiculous. So most of the stuff, and Dr. Ruth says over and over and over, like, I don't care if I'm a broken record. And so if you watch her shows, which span I think 14 years, it's a lot of the same messaging over and over and over. And she doesn't care if people got bored with it. She doesn't care if she's giving the same advice over and over to use a condom, to how to not premature ejaculate. Like, she often on the same shows was giving the same advice over and over and over, and really didn't take like the super sensational questions.
She's got a really active Twitter account. Does she actually do that herself?
She's very involved.
Because she's always giving like lots of advice. Have more sex. Like every day, it's like, have some sex today.
Yeah. Well, it's
especially during the presidential elections and the debates in 2016. She was giving a lot of stress reliever advice.
No, she's definitely a part of the Twitter. She loves watching, especially since the film is coming out, watching the number rise, because I think it's like pushing 100,000 now. So she'll be like, I have 88,000 followers. Now I have 89,000 followers. But Pierre, she calls him her Minister of Communications, which is a title she made up. And he writes all of her books with her, and he also runs her social media. So it's often, like I'm with her all the time, and she doesn't use a cell phone. So you'll take a picture of her with someone, and she'll say, send it to Pierre, tell him to put it on my Twitter.
She's really built a brand for herself. Mm-hmm. What's next for Dr. Ruth?
Well, there's Sex for Dummies is coming out, and I think she has 2 more books coming out next year. She keeps putting the pressure on me to make a sequel, which I'm sure we could. She's continuing to teach 2 university classes this semester and next semester. We can't slow her down. Like, she was supposed to come to London with me in a couple weeks, but then forgot that she had booked a speaking engagement in Dallas. So she's ping-ponging all over the country and the world still. So I don't see her slowing down anytime soon.
What's her secret?
Her secret is my favorite secret. People keep asking her that, and she says I don't have a secret, and I have to keep reminding her what her secret is that Dr. Ruth never lets anybody contact her before 10 a.m. which, like, I was taking on a film with an octogenarian. I hate mornings. I was like, oh, this is going to be the worst. We're going to be traveling the world. We're going to be waking up at 6 a.m. And that was one of her first rules, was like, never come to my room before 10 a.m. And so she goes to bed by midnight every night and sleeps until 9:30 and doesn't do any work or communication until 10 a.m. every day.
You heard it here first. Does anyone have any questions? I see a couple hands in the back. It's a little hard to see.
Wait for the mic.
Thank you. First of all, your interview answered most of my questions. It was a great interview. Thank you. My question is, in terms of preconceived ideas you had about Dr. Ruth, other than she doesn't like to talk about sex once she's off stage, what do you think, what did you learn about her that really surprised you the most?
Well, because I was young when Dr. Ruth was so famous, I think I had the idea that she was the funny old lady that talked about sex. And it wasn't until making the film and, first of all, delving into all the archival where you could watch how connected she was with every caller, with every person on her show, how deeply she cared about every person. But then especially in like the day-to-day interactions where there's a guy in the film, he actually just passed away a couple months ago, a good friend of Dr. Ruths named Greg Willenberg, who's a TV producer. But he's the guy who says every time I'm with her, somebody comes up and thanks her for saving their life or saving them from committing suicide. And I've seen that dozens of times just being with her all over the world because we traveled the world together. And so I think I was, I think I didn't understand the respect that Dr. Ruth was due, maybe because I was so young when she was so famous that, and I'm 37, and I think I'm on the younger cusp of people that know who Dr. Ruth is. And so what I'm really excited about with this film, and I see some young people in the audience, is introducing or reintroducing Dr. Ruth to a younger audience who are now reaping the benefits of everything that Dr. Ruth was doing in the 80s and 90s, but that they're not aware of her.
I mean, someone had to come first for there to be a sex positive movement now. Someone had to break the mold and be on TV because, and someone who was sort of had that like grandmother figure to them, someone who was safe. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Disarming, yeah.
Yeah, I have.
Oh, please wait for the mic.
Yeah, okay. Hi, I was interested to your other side, right here. What was her take on the Me Too movement right now?
You would have to ask her, but what I've heard her say many times is, consent is what Dr. Ruth has always been drilling from the very beginning. You have a couple times in the film where you see it. So always from the very beginning, she's always been about two consenting adults. And she had a great line at Sundance when I heard her get asked about the Me Too movement, where she said a woman needs to have the right to say no, and men, although they have sexual urges, need to understand when a woman says no, and when they say no, go home and masturbate.
Thank you very much for a wonderful documentary. It seemed quite comprehensive, and it was great to know her better since I grew up with her. I'm curious, though. Obviously, there's certain areas that she doesn't wish to discuss, and you didn't. But then you seem to have a comprehensive story of her life. So what would a sequel include?
I mean, the hardest part of making this film, because I was so compelled by Dr. Ruth's backstory, and the idea that she had kept all of her diaries and those letters from her parents as a filmmaker was such a boon. The idea that there was this woman at 89 years old who didn't want to talk about her childhood or her young adulthood, but handed over her real voice to me. Was incredible. So as you see in the film, so much of what constitutes the 99 minutes of the film are the backstory. And if I had another opportunity at making a sequel, I think it would have just involved so much more archival of the celebrity sex therapists, because we had to be very selective. Like every moment you see in the film was debated over and over and over by a team of people on what made it in from her television shows and her radio shows and why. But we watched thousands of hours of that, and it could be an amazing archival film if I got a shot at a sequel.
I'd love to get my hands on that archival. We'll talk.
Yeah, so she handed over all of her diaries to us. So those were the diaries that began, I believe, when she was 11 and lasted till she was about 20. And she had translated a lot of them when she wrote an autobiography in the 90s. So those were free reign to us to use the diaries. And as you notice in the film, we animated the childhood. And once we had access to the diaries, it was choosing, what memories, because it was a countless, it was her day-to-day life. It was her teenage diary. So it was just her daily, ramblings. And then we had to be very selective in choosing which memories made it into the film. And then when we knew a memory was going to make it into a film, then I would start having the conversation with Dr. Ruth, because I knew we were going to be animating it, about every detail that she remembered of that memory. So like, what did your parents' living room look like? What was the mountain that you and Walter used to go to? Did your bedroom look like in the orphanage? And that she was comfortable with. But I think it felt very safe to her just to like hand over her words to us and not have to sit there on camera with me and tell me what it was like to wave goodbye to her mother.
I mean, that's really painful. And also there's an expectation that just because someone is a public figure that they owe the public to rip their heart open, right? Which is something I've always respected about Dr. Ruth, that she really kept her personal life personal.
Thank you. Wonderful film. And I was wondering, with all of the travel and the locations and the friends, did that come your ideas? Or did she say, oh, I want to go to Switzerland, I want to go Israel and visit my friend? Did she generate all those ideas of places to go and people to interview?
Yeah, thank you for asking that. Now, that was all organic. In fact, once we decided that we were going to make the documentary, once she decided she wanted to do it and I decided that I had the time to do it, one of the very first shoots was our international travel, which runs contrary to like every skill in documentary filmmaking. Normally, your first shoot with someone would not be revisiting their painful past and walking through that. And it's also where we met her family. They were in Switzerland. So it turned out that after we all said yes to the film, that Dr. Ruth was going on a double trip, one to Switzerland with her family, which she does quite frequently. She and Fred, her husband, used to go there every year in the 80s and 90s to the Alps. And so she was taking her family there. And so that was an opportunity to go back to the orphanage where she was raised. And then she was adding on Israel, which she also does every year. And so she said, would you like to join us to Israel? And we didn't know that Dr. Ruth's first boyfriend lived in Israel and was still alive, and she goes sees him every year. Like, that came up while we were on the road. Like, oh, by the way, I might go see this guy, Walter. Who's Walter? Oh, Walter's my first boyfriend. What do you mean your first boyfriend? Oh, like my first true love from the orphanage. Like, it's the most, when I watch that scene, I'm like a very unemotional person. Still, when I watch that scene, I get teary-eyed because it's remembering, I think we cut it into 7 minutes or something. That was like 4 hours of getting to watch them reminisce about that time. And same thing with Marga.
With his wife.
With his wife in the kitchen. She kept her distance. No, but Dr. Ruth and her wife are good friends too. And Marga, her best friend, lives in Haifa, and she goes and sees her every year. And by the way, those are only the two that made it into the film. There were probably 3 or 4 other friends that she visited in Israel, one of whom has passed away since, who were also her friends from the orphanage, or people she dated. We met another ex-boyfriend from the orphanage. He just wasn't the
Got
first
around
one.
in those early years, huh?
I heard her say recently, like, were you always interested in sex? And, we have that scene in the film pulled from her diary where she's talking about reading that sex ed book, Diaries for Young Women, I think it's called. But she said, like, oh, I was always, the orphanage, I was the one teaching menstruation to the girls and getting yelled at by the headmistress. So, I think she was always, for whatever reason, very comfortable in her own skin and relaying that to other people.
Thank God. One more question?
Oh, great. Yeah, I want to say great film. I think you did a good job of mixing in personal and the politics or non-politics. And so I was just curious if she's ever expressed any opinions about within Europe, like women's rights are maybe a little more advanced, like being able to go to the beach topless, if she's expressed anything about that, or also because you did weave in Israel, and if she expressed anything about the Palestinians.
Yeah, wait, what was the first one? We were talking about this backstage. You were asking about European women. Liz was asking, like, how does she feel about prostitution?
Sex workers.
Sex workers.
Yeah.
And I've heard her say many times that, when she ended up at the Sorbonne in Paris was the first time she ever saw, it used to be a part in the film, actually. It was the first time she saw prostitutes on the street. And so she's always been, and you can see this in her shows, always been a champion of legalizing prostitution and making sure that it's a regulated industry where the sex workers can do it safely. And then, to your other question, she would have to speak for herself on the politics of Israel. But one thing that I remember always, like, Dr. Ruth has actually produced multiple documentaries in the 80s and 90s about religious minorities in Israel. Actually just met at a screening one of the producers of that was like, oh, I worked with Dr. Ruth on a documentary about this or that. And so politically speaking, as you see in the film, she's someone who has never engaged in electoral politics, like, of course, publicly. I've had political conversations with her. I've seen her have political conversations. As she says in the film, she votes in every election, including local elections. She takes being an American very seriously. She's just never seen it as part of her public persona to infuse that with her political views, because she never wanted to alienate a potential someone who needed help because of their political persuasions or religious persuasions. However, since the film has come out, from the moment it came out at Sundance, she will grab a microphone very quickly and start talking about the immigrant and refugee crisis and say, I'm finally willing to get political. When I see children being taken away from their families, this is my story. What is our country doing? And I think she takes her refugee status very seriously. The fact that she was a refugee to the US and we took her in, and she now is an American treasure, but we forget, she was an illegal immigrant at some point to the country. And so she's been very vocal about that. And also with the current administration, she's been very vocal about the threat to Planned Parenthood.
Rightfully so. Well, thank you all for being here, and thank you, Ryan, for letting us preview your new film.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.